Something, or more likely someone, became a media sensation. You found out all the gory details about whatever put them in the headlines. Then the story fades and life goes on. So, did you or did you not really get the whole story? Sarah Marshall's award-winning podcast, You're Wrong About, makes the case over and over that you did not. Sarah Marshall joins us now from Portland, Oregon for more. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
First off, congratulations. You hit 5 years of doing your podcast, You're Wrong About. What does it mean? Did you think this was going to happen? What does it mean to have hit that benchmark?
I mean, I guess it means that we haven't run out of stories, and I don't think that we ever will. And I think it means that we found something to do. I've been able to find something to do where I can do what I love for a living, which is everybody's dream. And what I love to do is to, get into a research hole, to get documents and newspaper articles and kind of look at what people were talking about at the time. And often, not to position myself as this fabulous researcher, because often the truth is a few inches below the surface. And I think that what has made the show last is that people like hearing these stories, not because it makes them feel like they're being scolded, but because it makes them feel more forgiving of themselves and each other and feel closer to humanity, I think.
Tell us, for some of the viewers who may not be familiar with your podcast, this launched in 2018. Tell us the backstory. Why did you launch You're Wrong About in the first place?
Yeah. So the podcast started because Michael Hobbs, a fantastic journalist, approached me and said he wanted to do a podcast about misremembered history. He specifically wanted to do a show about 90s media phenomena, which I love. And I asked if we could have all of history available because I wanted to someday do an episode on Leopold and Loeb. And he had read an article I'd written on Tonya Harding, where basically I had gone through sort of the information we had available and pointed out what seems in retrospect to be extremely obvious, which is that this was a story that was being sold as a broad comedy, and yet there was a lot of tragedy in it. 1994 was a time when you could allege very serious domestic abuse and the public could just kind of laugh at you. And there didn't have to be a segment of the conversation about you that took any of it seriously. And so I felt like I had a ton of stories when he approached me that I wanted to tell that were like that, where it felt like there was just a bigger story than the media had the room to depict, because there was the voice that got to be heard. There was really just like one voice that people got to experience describing these stories they wanted to hear. There wasn't space for a lot of pushback on it. And now with the media landscape we have, it's brought in a lot of complexity. And I think this is one of the positive complexities we have, that we can go back and try and do justice to stories that the story was flattened into simplicity at the time when we first tried to understand them.
I'm hoping you can pull back the curtain in terms of the producing that goes behind it, the research that goes behind it. How do you select your topics and your guests? Because for the longest time, you did have Michael on the other side of the seat, but now we have guests who come on regularly. So tell us sort of the thought process behind topics. I'm sure your viewers are throwing topics at you left, right, and center, like do this next. But what's the actual process?
I mean, it definitely is a gut thing. And if I'm doing the research, then it has to be based on whether I can kind of get into a headspace of just feeling committed enough and passionate enough to get in there and do the work that you have to do to really find new information, or to kind of see what was hiding in plain sight. And so I think learning how to choose guests in the post-Mike world has been like, that was a real challenge to try and figure out what criteria we needed for the guests that we had, because the thing about Mike and I that I think really drew people to the show initially was that we had this great rapport, and that we were talking about history in a serious way and in a thoughtful way, but that we also were really gossiping with each other. And that we had this tone of like, what we are talking about is sad, but the experience of sharing it with you and trying to make meaning with you is joyful. And I think that was why people remained attached to the show, is because they went to it to know that they were going to learn things that potentially made them uncomfortable, but to have a good time listening to friends. And so I think the people that I have on now, um, I love it when it's somebody who's passionate about a topic, who's kind of speaking with their heart as well as their brain. And also when it's, somebody who I can kind of find space in a conversation with, to feel like we are making something bigger than the sum of our parts as two individuals. And, a recent example that jumps to mind is we just had Alison McCabe on talking about her new book on Sinead O'Connor. And that's something that listeners have been asking for since the beginning. And I've always known it was a good idea. And just the moment wasn't right for me to be the person to tell that story. And then Allison came along and was the right person. And I loved doing that episode.
Awesome. I want to give our viewers an idea of what the show sounds like. I have another great example. Here's you talking about the case of Kitty Genovese with your former co-host, Michael Hobbs. Have a listen.
Do you have any sense of when this happened?
I was thinking about this last night and thinking, like, was it the 1890s or was it like the 1960s? I can't even place this in geologic time.
Do you know what city it is?
New York City.
It's in New York. Yeah, this is a story about a real life woman who became a metaphor.
Ooh.
And this happened in New York City in 1964.
Okay.
And it happened in Queens.
Oh.
Is that surprising?
No, I mean, I said because it seemed like you needed a reaction, but it seems like, all right, that's a part of New York that I've never been to.
I know we're talking about a murder and a very famous murder, but you guys have a great time on the show, and it's very obvious there. I do want to pick up on that murder case. Why was that murder case ripe for a re-examination?
Yeah, it's really nostalgic to hear that tape, by the way, because I don't listen to old episodes that much. But I'm like, oh yeah, there's like a Peter and the Wolf quality there. I'm the cello and he's the timpani. It's really lovely. So Kitty Genovese was a woman who, as we heard in that clip, kind of became a symbol of something both bigger than herself and counter to what her life was really about, because she was murdered by a random assailant while walking home from work in 1964. This initially wasn't reported on very much, and something that didn't come out until much later was that Kitty Genovese, incredibly for the time, was living her life as a lesbian. She had a partner. She was she loved her sexuality, as far as we can tell, in a time when it was all about violence and shame. And so her murder was something that became famous because the New York Times, with information fed to them by the police, published it as a story about, it wasn't about her murder necessarily as much as about this idea that there had been so many witnesses to the crime and all of them had either been indifferent to it or kind of enjoyed it. There was the idea being sold that New Yorkers were so morally bankrupt that they watched murders for fun. And this was a story that spread around the world. It was a story my mother told me when I was an adolescent girl, kind of explaining to me the limitations that had to be placed on my life because you're a girl, girls are born to be victims, and in New York City, they kill people for fun. And what turned out to be the case was that this was a murder that happened in the week. There were so many factors that went into what happened. It happened in the middle of the night. Very few people had a clear view of any of it. The people who could see something didn't see enough to convince them that what they saw was dangerous. Some people saw the assault begin in front of a bar, which made them believe that it was a marital dispute and therefore not their business, because a stranger is not allowed to assault a woman, but her husband or boyfriend is. And the person who had, people tried to call the police. There was no 911 yet. NYPD is famous for being jerks, and that was the case at the time as well. And the one person who had the best view of the murder was a gay man, and a man who had every reason to be terrified of what the police would do to him. And then kind of in the last contradiction, in Kitty Genovese's dying moments, a friend of hers who lived in the building rushed out at great personal risk and held her as she died. So it was not a story of indifference, but a story of social systems not working, about homophobia and violence against queer New Yorkers, and about the police not doing their job and the media helping them to cover it up, which is scarier, actually.
I want to talk about another episode your first episode.
Mm-hmm.
It was on the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. But more so, why are moral panics so prevalent in American culture?
That's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things I think about moral panics is that they allow us to register our sense that something is wrong, and then to aim our concern in the wrong direction, basically. So the satanic panic came along at a time when, this is very hard to remember now, but this was the beginning of the realization, aided in large part by feminism of the 1970s, that child sexual abuse was endemic. It wasn't just something that happened to you. It was something that was happening in so many households, and that so many people were living with as a secret, or as something that was supposed to not be as big a deal to them as it clearly was. And I think that when the broader culture started to catch up with that knowledge, one of the obvious next things to do was to think, well, we're living in a society where women and children are extremely dependent on men as wage earners. Maybe abuse could be mitigated if it were easier to leave the home, if you found out that abuse was happening, and if your husband or your child's parent was committing abuse. It was a moment when we were attempting to pass the ERA. We were trying to kind of create a world where, if men are abusive, then we can dream of a future where they don't have so much free reign to abuse, and where people, where the women and children who they are abusing have nowhere to go. And the response that the culture in the United States, specifically also in the moment when kind of evangelical Christianity was working its way into government, the response that we had instead was to say, the family is fine, Satanists are the problem, lesbians are the problem. And we don't have to look at any of the way society is organized. Everything we're doing is great, but there are Satanists and we have to look at them. And so I think that, in that case and many others, moral panics, I think, are appealing to us because they allow us to imagine that the threat is far away as opposed to somewhere inside the house.
All right. I want you to help me examine media stories, the current media stories. Has the media gotten better at examining stories with more nuance than it did in the past?
I mean, oh my God, I don't know. I wish I had a stronger opinion. I feel like there's so much more space for different voices. There's so much space for countervailing opinions and for people to kind of poke holes in kind of obvious falsehoods and stories that we see in mainstream media. But at the same time, the size and the pressure of the misinformation that people have to deal with is so tremendous that I wonder if we've made progress. I think it really depends who you are. I think that if you are feeling critical of what you see, and if you want to kind of think more complexly about what's going on and go in search of that, then I think there's so much more available to you, and it's so much easier to get. That there's, the speed at which information travels has not only brought us great things, I think.
With that being said, is there a story in the last year or two that you said, hey, I'm going to bookmark that, and we're going to revisit this conversation in a couple of years because there is something missing here?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I look at stories that happen now and I feel like what needs to be said is being said, and it doesn't have the power to affect things the way we might have once dreamed. That, I think I in maybe a very childlike way used to imagine that the truth had a power of its own, and that if the truth could only get out and people could hear it, then they would kind of stop what they were doing and understand the power of just the sort of rationality that was reaching them. And yet we can see, specifically in the US currently, in the way that we are creating legislation about trans kids and about criminalizing people's gender and sexuality, that's a story that not everybody, but I think a lot of people understand exactly what's going on and are powerless to stop it, or at least feel powerless in the moment. And yeah, there are stories. I think the thing that I love doing about the show too is that with smaller stories and kind of celebrity stories, I am like everybody else. I kind of get swept along by the dominant narrative at the time, and then it takes a little while for me to look back and say, what did I miss? And that's why I love doing a history show.
Now, we've seen quite a few films, podcasts, and TV shows do what you do in recent years. How do you feel about this sort of trend?
I think it's great. I mean, I think that we have a guest star.
I like it.
I think that there's, when I was initially trying to pitch the stories that the podcast ended up being all about, the response that I got typically from editors was like, well, who cares if we did a bad job covering Amy Fisher? It's not interesting to talk about what we could have done differently with Amy Fisher. This is not Quantum Leap. And I think what the success of You're Wrong About and of then, the other forms of media that are kind of trying to do the same task, kind of look back and look at these figures that everybody knows who they are and yet doesn't know them at all. I like that we recognize that this is very compelling. Like I always knew, and now more people know. I love that.
Pamela Anderson criticized the FX series Pam and Tommy, which portrayed, of course, a fictionalized version of her sex tape scandal from the 1990s. Can revisionist history get things wrong sometimes?
Oh, yeah, completely. I mean, I think that this is, like, we're in a weird area too, right? Where, like, I think the kind of journey is that you realize that people are interested in revisionist history. And then once we know that there's an interest in something, then we start to see the understanding on behalf of people who have these jobs that old tabloid stories can be monetized into new limited series and TV shows and movies and whatever else, and those overproduced podcasts that ABC makes. And, what happens with that, unfortunately, is that like tabloid stories of the olden times were crafted the way that they were because when human beings read the news, we don't want facts, we want a story. And we, journalists at various times and in various industries, myself included, inevitably are incentivized to streamline a story, to make someone's life more satisfying because it feels like a narrative rather than just a collection of stuff that happened. And I think that, without narrative, it's harder for us to learn and it's harder for us to remember and feel moved. But there is kind of a side of narrative making where you kind of understand, how do I please this crowd? What is the most crowd-pleasing story that I could tell? And the problem with that is that in tabloids in the past and now in, TV shows and movies that we make of those stories, today the end result is the same, which is that often stories that simplify characters, make them into archetypes that we feel familiar and comfortable with as opposed to sort of humans in their full complexity. Those are the stories that are easier to invest in because it's easier to believe that they'll make money. And I think that that's how people who have been flattened before end up flattened still.
Sarah Marshall, thank you so much and good luck with another fantastic year ahead of you.
Thank you so much. This was a delight.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.